Hey, all you cool cats and kittens, it's your favorite history teacher back again with another historical video. And today, continuing on our life on the home front, we're going to look at some aspects of Eastern Europe on obviously the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So, without further ado, let's just get on into it. All right. Chapter 15, Lesson 2. Here we go. All right, write the title down. That was your warm up. So we're going to compare and contrast Soviet leaders and their policies, summarize aspects of Soviet control of Eastern Europe, and identify the causes and effects of Eastern European resistance to Soviet control. Didn't think you'd hear that word before. So after the war, World War II devastated the Soviet Union. To create this new industrial base, Stalin, remember he's still alive. Stalin returned to the method that he used during the 30s. Soviet workers were expected to produce goods for export for little in return for themselves. The incoming capital from abroad could be then used to buy machinery and Western technology. Economic recovery in the Soviet Union was spectacular in some respects. By 1950, Russian industrial production surpassed pre war levels by 40%. New power plants, canals, and giant factories were built. Industrialization finally came, right? Heavy industry increased chiefly for military benefit, though. The hydrogen bomb was tested in 1953, and the first space satellite, Sputnik 1, in 1957 enhanced the Soviet Union's reputation as a world power. Yet, the people were shortchanged. The production of consumer goods did not increase as much as heavy industry, and there was a housing shortage. As a British official in Moscow reported, every room is both a living room by day and bedroom by night. Well, that's like the Bay Area. So here you got the Soviet Union. It is big. It is a beast. It's everywhere. Okay. Left is the German and Soviet occupation zones in Poland. And below are all the Soviet socialist republics. There's a lot. That's the destruction after World War II. There's Stalin. I wish I could read Russian. This is, if you don't believe me, this is the jump we're talking about right here. All right, Stalin's legacy. So Stalin was the undisputed master of the Soviet Union. He distrusted his competitors, he exercised sole power, and he had little respect for other Communist Party members or leaders. He is reported to have said to his members of his inner circle in 1952, "You are blind as kittens. What would you do without me?" So Stalin's suspicions added to the regime's increasing repression. In 1946, the government ordered all literary and scientific work to conform to the state political needs. As along with this, the anti-intellectual campaign came political terror. And this threat of more purges in 1953 disappeared, however, when Stalin died March 5th, 1953. So Daddy Stalin. I again don't know what these mean. You can look them up. Again, Stalin and the ghost of years past, Lenin. He remembers his homeboy. The purges, if you recall, were brought back, and this is how they did it. And then he tries to be like Lenin. Remember, Lenin was like crossed arms. Bye, Felicia. All right, Special K. So a group of leaders will succeed Stalin, but the new general secretary of the Communist Party, Nikita Khrushchev, soon emerged as the chief Soviet policymaker. After he was in power, Khrushchev took steps to undo some of the worst features of the Stalinist regime. At the 20th Congress of the Communist Party in 1956, Khrushchev condemned Stalin for his administrative violence and mass repression and terror. And that is something you did not do. And so he spoke out against his boy Stalin, and it's this process of eliminating the more ruthless policies of Stalin is known as De-Stalinization. That's on your final. Khrushchev loosened government controls on literary and artistic works in 1962. For example, he allowed the publication of One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich. This novel was written by Alexander Solzhenitsyn. It's a grim portrayal of life in Siberian labor camp. Many Soviets identified with Ivan as a symbol of suffering endured under Stalin. Khrushchev also placed a more emphasis on producing more consumer goods. He attempted to increase agricultural output by growing corn and cultivating vast lands of the east of the Ural Mountains. This attempt, however, was unsuccessful and damaged Khrushchev's reputation with the party. This failure, combined with the increased military spending, hurt the Soviet economy. The industrial growth rate, which soared in the early 50s, now declined sharply from 13% in 1953 to 7.5% by 1964. Foreign policy failures also damaged Khrushchev's reputation among his colleagues. His rash plan to place missiles in Cuba was the final straw. While he was away on vacation, a special meeting of the Soviet leaders voted him out of office because of, quote, deteriorating health and forced him into retirement. So that's Khrushchev giving the speech. Here's some pictures. And then this is a statue of Stalin that he's drilling. That's him meeting with JFK. I believe this is after the Cuban Missile Crisis. All right, the thaw continues. So when Nikita Khrushchev was removed from office in 64, two men, Alexei Kosygin and Leonid Brezhnev replaced him. Brezhnev, however, emerged as the dominant leader in the 70s. He was determined to keep Eastern Europe under the control of the communist governments and was not interested in reform. Brezhnev insisted on the Soviet Union's right to intervene if communism was threatened in another communist state, and it's called the Brezhnev Doctrine. That's on your final. At the same time, Brezhnev benefited from détente, which is a relaxation of tensions and improved relations between the U.S. and USSR, also on your final. In the 1970s, the two superpowers signed the SALT I and SALT II Strategic Arms Limitation Treaties and the Anti-Ballistic Missile ABM Treaty to limit nuclear arms. Those three are on your final. But because they felt more secure, Soviet leaders relaxed their authoritarian rule and allowed more access to Western music, dress, and art. Of course, dissidents, those who spoke out against the regime, were still suppressed. For example, you have a man named Andrei Sakharov, father of the Soviet hydrogen bomb, was punished for defending human rights. Interesting how a man who develops the hydrogen bomb, which is more powerful than the nuclear bomb, was defending human rights. Interesting. That's Kosygin on the left. That's Brezhnev on the right. These are plans to invade Czechoslovakia. That's Brezhnev and Nixon. And you have the American people shaking hands with the Soviet people, but the Soviet people are in chains. This is, I believe, one of the SALT treaties being signed. And that's another SALT treaty because that's Jimmy Carter. President Carter. President Carter. No motivation. So Brezhnev continued to emphasize heavy industry among his economic policies. Two problems, however, weakened the Soviet economy. The government's central planning led to huge complex bureaucracy that discouraged efficiency and will lead to indifference. And collective farmers had no incentive to work hard. Many preferred their own small private plots to laboring in the collective work brigades. In the 70s, the communist ruling class in the Soviet Union had become complacent and corrupt. Party and state leaders, including army leaders and secret police leaders of the KGB, enjoyed a high standard of living. Brezhnev was unwilling to tamper with party leadership and state bureaucracy, regardless of the inefficiency and corruption his system encouraged. So that's Brezhnev and the Soviet Socialist Republics. His thick old eyebrows. By the 70s, détente had allowed the U.S. to allowed the U.S. grain and consumer goods to be sold to the Soviet Union. However, détente collapsed in 1979 when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, and a new East West confrontation will begin. The Soviet Union wanted to restore a pro Soviet regime in Afghanistan, and the U.S. viewed this as an act of expansion. To show his disapproval, President Jimmy Carter canceled the U.S. participation in the 1980 Olympic Games that were going to be held in Moscow. He also placed an embargo on shipment of U.S. grain to the Soviets because the Soviets could not grow enough grain to feed themselves, the largest country in the world. Could not grow enough grain to feed themselves, so they had to buy. They had to buy from us. Relations became even chillier when Ronald Reagan became president of the United States. He called the Soviet Union, quote, an evil empire, and he began a military buildup and a new arms race, even though that's what SALT 1 and SALT 2 were meant in place to do. Reagan even gave military aid to the Afghan rebels to maintain a war in Afghanistan, a war the Soviet Union could ultimately not win. So this is a map of the Soviet invasion routes. These are pictures of the first 40 days. So this is in theory what they're going to do. Bomb Kabul and then, go back out. And this is what happened. So the Soviets were supported by China. What is that? That's North Korea. I don't know these two country flags. But the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan was supported by the U.S., Britain, that's NATO, and I don't know what that flag is. So here are pictures of the Soviet-Afghan invasion. And these resistance fighters are called the Mujahideen, the evil empire. All right, Soviet influence. So a timetable of the Soviet takeover varied from country to country. From 1945 to 47, Soviet-controlled communist governments became firmly entrenched in East Germany, Bulgaria, Romania, Poland, and Hungary. In Czechoslovakia, where the tradition of democracy and a multi-party system, the Soviets did not seize control of the government until 1948. Albania and Yugoslavia were the exceptions of this pattern of dominance. During World War II, both countries had strong communist movements that resisted the Nazis. After the war, these movements went on to form local communist parties to take control of the government. Communists in Albania set up a Stalinist regime that grew more and more independent of the Soviet Union. In Yugoslavia, a guy named Josip Broz, known as Tito, was the leader of the communist resistance movement. After World War II, he created an independent communist state in Yugoslavia, that South Slav state from World War I. Stalin had hoped to take control of Yugoslavia as he had once done in Eastern European countries, but Tito refused to give in to Stalin's demands. Tito gained support of the people by portraying the struggle as one of Yugoslav national freedom. Tito will rule Yugoslavia until his death in 1980. Although communist, it was never a Soviet satellite. Interesting. Between 1948 and until Stalin's death in 1953, Eastern European satellite states were directed by the USSR, followed Stalin's example. They instituted Soviet-type 5-year plans with emphasis on heavy industry rather than consumer goods. They collectivized agriculture, eliminated all non-communist parties, and set up their institutions of repression, secret police, and military forces. So you have the satellites, and then you have Yugoslavia, which wasn't a satellite. That's Tito. That's Tito again. Anti. Communism did not develop deep roots in Eastern European peoples, but the Soviets exploited Eastern Europe economically for its own benefit and made living conditions harsh for most people. They're like, if we have to suffer in our country, we're going to bring the suffering to you. After Stalin's death, many Eastern European states began to pursue a new course. In the late 50s and 60s, the USSR made it clear, especially in Poland, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia, that it would not allow Eastern European satellites, Eastern European, to become independent from Soviet control in 1956. Protests erupted in Poland after a strike by factory workers was violently suppressed. Although the strike was centered on better working conditions, which communists all want, right? The protests introduced a desire of some insurgents for a more moderate form of communism. In response, the Polish Communist Party adopted a series of reforms in October and elected Władysław Gormulka. I think that's how you pronounce it. I may have butchered it as their first secretary. Gormulka declared that Poland had the right to follow its own socialist path. Fearful of Soviet armed response, the Poles compromised, and Poland pledged to remain loyal to the Warsaw Pact. So there's some pictures. That's Gormulka. Hungry for change. So developments in Poland in 56 led to Hungarian communists to seek the same kinds of reform. Unrest in Hungary, combined with economic difficulties, led for calls for a revolt. To quell the arising rebellion, Imre Nagy, the Hungarian leader, declared Hungary a free nation November 1st, 1956, and promised free elections. It soon became clear that this could mean the end of communist rule in Hungary, so Khrushchev, because he's the leader in 56, was in no position to allow a member of communist nations to leave. 3 days after Nagy's declaration, the Soviet army attacked Budapest, and the Soviets reestablished control over the country. Nagy was seized by the military and was promptly executed. What a shame. They took down Stalin's statue. When the tanks come marching in, that's Imre Nagy. All right, springtime. The situation in Czechoslovakia in the 50s was different as Stalin placed Antonin Novotny, Little Stalin, aka, in power in 53. By the late 60s, Novotny had alienated many members of his own party. He was especially disliked by Czechoslovakian writers. A writers' rebellion, which encouraged to take control of their own lives, led to Novotny's resignation in 68. In January 68, Alexander Dubček, the elected first secretary of the Communist Party. Dubček introduced a number of reforms, including freedoms of speech and press and freedom to travel abroad. He relaxed censorship and began to pursue an independent foreign policy and promised democratization of Czechoslovakian political system. Dubček hoped to create socialism with a human face. A period of euphoria broke out that became known as the Prague Spring, but the euphoria proved to be short-lived as Czechoslovakian insurgents varied with their ideals, some wishing to reform the Communist Party that was less restrictive, and others were against communism as a whole. Regardless of their desires, the Soviet Union feared losing control, so they invaded Czechoslovakia in 68 to crush the movement. Gustav Husak, I think that's how you say it, replaced Dubček, revoked his reforms, and reestablished the old order. Aw, spring was over so soon. One of them's Dubček, one of them's Husak. Again, the Soviets come marching in. That's Husak. And that means we're done. Hold on. I need to get the book. Wait, my notes are right here. All right. So that's going to conclude the slideshow. No. So your homework is to do page 567, 2 through 4. Page 567, 2 through 4. So yeah, hopefully you guys did enjoy that. I know it was a lot of me. Obviously, it's only me talking, but it provides some insight that as leaders changed, they kind of differentiated. Khrushchev, started this de-Stalinization process. You had Brezhnev taking over Khrushchev, and then some styles of revolts that were ultimately unsuccessful. So it is what it is. All right. If you guys did enjoy that, make sure you hit that like button, leave a comment, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.